want to, if you sit there, then I can see you when I look. Otherwise, you speak. I've got my back to you. Right. Good evening, colleagues. I think let's start. I'm not sure whether to say good evening or good afternoon, but it's one of the two. So it's a nice intimate affair tonight, and I see this beautiful family sitting here. I saw pictures of you beforehand. Extremely photogenic, so jealous. But let me say welcome to this wonderful event. It's a very special event for Professor Manase and his family. Well-deserved, many years of work, and we are so glad that we can share this moment with you, and we look forward to your lecture. But allow me to just welcome a few people, dignitaries, and the first dignitary I have to mention is the Vice Dean of Humanities, Professor Chicha Twala. Then the Executive Director of Student Affairs, Mr. Themba Shlashu, indicated that he would join us, but maybe he'll join us later. And the same with Dr. Russell Ali. I don't see them yet, but he will probably join us from Institutional Advancement. And then, of course, a warm and special welcome to the man of the hour, Professor Irikidzayi Manase. And then to his guests, I want to mention them all one by one. Dr. Ndaka Manase, Professor Manase's wife, Ms. Anusu and Ms. Vimbai Manase. I'd like to know who's who. Anusu and then Vimbai, nice to meet you. And then the two boys, the two gentlemen, the men, Mr. Brandon, thank you, and Mr. Bradley Manase. Wonderful, thank you very much. So also then welcome to external stakeholders if they are in the audience of the UFS, any members of the Student Representative Council, can't really see past the first couple of rows. And then members of the Department of English and then other colleagues from other departments in the humanities and at the university, as well as students. And then if there are any stakeholders joining us virtually, also a warm welcome to them. And then they say, you're never too old to learn. So I'm taking my cue from Chicha. He always welcomes himself. So I think tonight I'm going to welcome myself as well. They say imitation is the best form of flattery. So there you go. Colleagues, allow me to introduce, but he needs no introduction, Professor Iri Manase to you. Iri, if you can stand up, please. Professor Manase obtained his PhD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2007 in English Studies, and it was at the Maritzburg campus. His master's degree in 2003 at the University of Natal, BA Honours in 1997 at the University of Zimbabwe, and then also the BA General in 1993 in Economic History and English, also at the University of Zimbabwe. Previous academic institutions where he worked include the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Pietermaritzburg, Department of Language and Linguistics, and then also the University of Venda. Iri has 15 years' experience as a full-time academic and lecturer, and he joined the University of the Free State in 2014 as a senior lecturer in the Department of English. I'm sure those of you who work closely with him will know all the areas of specialization, but it's sometimes good for outsiders, those who are not so close to him, to hear all the variety of areas that he has published on. He has published in the areas of literary and cultural geographies of Southern Africa and Africa. Here he's published specifically on the Southern African city, urban youth cultures, the intersection between land and other natural resources, politics, media, and identities, representations of the African diaspora, speculative literatures, and South African futurist imaginaries. And we do need a future for this country, so we need people like him. Prof Manase is also the author of one book, 25 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and he co-edited 3 special journal issues, as well as presented many papers nationally and internationally. He's a C2 NRF-rated researcher and a fellow of the Carnegie Foundation of Africa Humanities program, having been a recipient of postdoctoral and book manuscript publication grants. He serves on various editorial boards, and I think there are quite a few, so I'm just going to maybe mention the post-colonial book series, Rodopi, based in Amsterdam. As a supervisor, he has 5 masters and 8 PhD students under the belt. In addition to being the secretary of the Africa Humanities Association, he's also the chair of the Southern African Association of Commonwealth Language and Literature Studies. He has extensive networks across the world, in South Africa and across African continent, and they collaborated in various areas on, for instance, pandemic literatures and being human, Southern African literature, as well as currently working together with someone from the City University of New York on African futures and infrastructure that involves researchers across the world, from the UK, the USA, as well as various parts of the African continent. The multi-institutional project on pandemic literatures and being human, titled Text, Human Rights and Pandemics, Being Human in Times of Contagion, culminated in a prestigious visiting scholar fellowship at STIAS in November 2020. So, colleagues, I present to you Professor Irikidzayi Manase, and we look forward to listening to you on a lecture titled The Stories of Our Lives, Being Human, and the Literary and Cultural Imaginings Thereof, Past, Present, and Future. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thank you to the Dean, Professor Hudson, for the generous introduction, and to the Deputy, the Vice Dean, Professor Twala. I also want to thank the colleagues who are here from the Department of English, colleagues from the CUT, friends, and my family as well, to whom I will speak about in the dedication of this lecture. So I also thank everybody who is here. And so thank you very much for being here and for the opportunity to be part of this important occasion for me and my family. This then takes me to the dedication before I go on to the lecture. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to my family and friends. I want to start off with my family, my wife, Ndaka, for the sacrifices that are huge and enormous to list. I can start off by saying I came to study in 2002, a year after we had just married. So you can imagine what it means up to this time. I also want to dedicate this to my family, to my children, Anesu, Wimbai, Bradley, and Brandon. In the paper that I had with my wife, where I'd written some little something, I had said it's, I want to thank them for the lovely, this mixture of loveliness and bothersomeness of some sort. So I thank them for that, and yeah. I dedicate this to my father, who introduced me to stories that I want to talk about today. He never admonished me after I opened his box from Mount Selida Mission, where he was studying, where I was able to start reading at a very early age books by Booker T. Washington and other great writers of our time. It planted the seed for reading. That led me to read all the African writer series while I was still at primary school, the Hardy Boys, the Pest Setters, and so forth. I also dedicate this to my mother. Both my parents passed on, but I dedicate this to my mother as well for teaching us to value hard work. In Chindau, she would always say, "Mnofanira kutsimitira." In other words, you have to work hard. You must makaza, you must show that you are really working. And she also taught us a value as a family, and something that is probably one of the family who inherited that, which is speaking what you believe in and always speaking the greater good for everybody. Sometimes even when those to whom you are speaking about or you are showing solidarity might not even have the strength to say anything. I also want to dedicate this to my friends, the colleagues whom I grew up with, my childhood friends, and those whom I met along the way. So that's the part of the dedication. And so we get to this lecture, which has already been pointed out, is the stories of our lives being human and the literary and cultural imaginings thereof, past, present, and future. It's about stories. And perhaps the best way to start am I doing it the right thing? Or am I pressing the right thing? Sorry, I just want to go on to the next slide, where I speak about the importance and the power of stories. Okay, thanks. All right. Okay. I want to speak about the power of stories, which is the central idea in my lecture. I'm interested in the power of stories. Stories that make sense of being in the world. Stories about the everyday and striving to make meaning and live life fully. I'm interested in stories that draw the social, political, and spatial aesthetics of our past, present, and future. And I yearn for stories that, upon our close listening and reading, make us realize our shared location on this global space and the commonalities we have as human beings. I seem to be getting this wrong. How do I get to the next? We practiced this, but there's a little bit of some glitch on. Do I have to do it this way or? Okay. Oh, all right. Once I've done that. All right. Okay. Sorry about that. So, in my thinking of what stories, the power of stories, what they can be and what they can do, as this lecture was ringing in my mind, I had these ideas or perspectives on stories that I thought I would put in as the stepping stone into my discussion. And these are ideas by Carr in Narrative, Time and History, and McIntyre in After Virtue, who note that individual and social actions constitute the lived story. I'm particularly interested in the lived story and how it influences or leads us to other stories. I'm also interested, or these are the perspectives that also influence my thinking here. Aaron Gare in Narrative and the Ethics and Politics of Environmentalism, the transformative power of stories, in which he says, stories are told in being lived and lived in being told. The latter part of that page, he also says, narrated stories enable people to envisage in an immediate, practical way, new possibilities, new identities, new goals, new communities, new ways of living, and the paths of realizing such possibilities. I love the idea of a story that is lived. that comes from social action. So perhaps I should start from the story that I lived, a lived story, a story that my wife, I never told her, but she was part of it. The story of us being stuck at Beitbridge border post from Monday the 4th of January to the 7th of January in 2021. This was the time of COVID. My mother had passed on and we had gone there for the funeral. The burial was on Sunday the 3rd. We didn't have any network in Chimanimani because it's mountainous. And for some reason, on Monday the 4th, messages started coming in. We started receiving messages in our phones. Last and behold, the government had proclaimed that the border was going to be closed. All entry points, except the airports, were going to be closed on that day. And so we drove all the way from Chimanimani to the Beitbridge border post. We arrived there at 7 o'clock in the evening. There was a curfew. Everything had to come to a standstill at 8 o'clock. Driving into Beitbridge border post was like a surreal entrance into something else. It was chaotic. There were a lot of people walking towards the border. Cars were trucks. There was no rule of law, traffic laws to consider. We moved into onto the oncoming traffic lane. We just wanted to get there. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what was going to happen, but all we knew was that at 8 o'clock that day, that was going to be the end. And we still had hope that we would make it in an hour to the other side. But we didn't. We stayed at the Beitbridge border post from the 4th Monday evening until Thursday in the morning. Later, we would stay for 4 days in the queue. It barely moved for the first 2 days. I think on the second day, on Tuesday, we only moved about 5 meters. We endured the health risks in the time of COVID. There was no social distance to talk about. Maybe I should just show you some of the pictures, or I'll get into the pictures because it will be a bit. This is just how it looked, how it was. The cars, we didn't even know where they were getting to. And this is how it was. I just want to go back to the slide to guide me here. We developed this DPATs, for the lack of the appropriate word, anxiety syndrome, disposition of some sort. It was chaotic. We couldn't go back. The car was hemmed somewhere in there, but you can't get out. You can't go anywhere. You wanted to go away. The family is over that side. If you go back, you know that, Zimbabwe is under military democracy. So chances of you even traveling back are not as easy as you think they can be. It was only until Wednesday, around 10, 11, when we heard that the Minister of Home Affairs, Mr. Aaron Mutsoaledi, had arrived at Border Bridge, negotiated with the Zimbabwean side and so forth. They closed the border post because the government in Zimbabwe had said the border post was closed. And so there were some negotiations from 12. That's when movement started. Some cars started getting into the border post onto the other side. We jostled to get into the lane that we were supposed to be. Scratching of cars, bumping here and there. And if you're not on the right side, you were asked to go back. We don't even know where, considering that there was a long queue. Wednesday night, we slept again, looking at the gate into the border post. Thursday, we started everything, the process, and eventually we were on the South African side. By about 12:01, we were in Louis Trichardt, where we took a rest. But what I want to take from this is, judging from what the idea of a story as a lived and socially produced, I want to highlight the story that is constituted here, apart from the story that we created, that we lived, from the inertia, from the aspect, from the thinking, from the disposition that we had. And this is the story that was constituted through listening to other people's stories of how they left their homes, how in a hurry, how they because the roads were bad, had tire punctures. How life is over that side. They don't even have any money anymore. How stories of aspiration that if I get there, even if I don't have the right papers, immigration permits to go to the other side, something almost always happens at the border post, and I'll always get over that side. So there were these stories that were taking place. There was also this vibrancy that was taking place that we're witnessing of people in the Bedbridge city, Bedbridge border town itself, the residents. They took the moment, seized the moment, started selling water, bottled water, soft drinks, food, offering services for, ablution and shower services, bathing services at their home for a fee, of course. So it was a mixture of so many things. And one story that I want to use as a stepping stone. Here I call this a zamazama, but it's not really a zamazama. It's a guma. Those guys that want to take a chance with you and get something out of you. He just came to us as we were standing and said, Taima, Mdara, Taima, old man, we offer services where we can lift your car, take it over to the other side, and you go over the border. It was really interesting. We laughed at it. But of course, it was a replica, a continuation of this social media meme or something that has been going on, where people would say, our duty, for instance, we specialize in imprisoning your parents so that they won't go to funerals, so that they, and then you keep them safe. We specialize in sending thugs to the headmaster so that the headmaster will write a good report for your kid. So this was the kind of meme that was going on. But on retrospect, it leads to this idea of stories that I want to talk about, the issue of possibilities. So I want to put this story production and storying into perspective. And I start off by a reminder of Gaye's statement that narrated stories enable people to envisage in an immediate, practical way new possibilities, new identities, new goals, new communities, new ways of living, and the paths to realizing such possibilities. My experiences resonate with the story of our times in Southern Africa, or in South Africa, or in Southern Africa. Life that are associated with crisis performances, stories that come out of that. Riker calls that the living out of stories. And these are enunciated in various ways. We create stories. We live in a way that creates stories in ways that we sometimes don't understand or don't seem to think, theorized by De Soto, such as the enunciation, the footsteps that we make create stories when people look at us. The echoes of our audio and visual sensing make stories. So these experiences afforded, judging or drawing from the statement by Gaye, envisaging, thinking, putting things into perspective, and drawing from pandemic literatures because it was time of the pandemic. There's also from one of the scholars who influenced our project, Paolo Giordano, on how contagion works, who says pandemics forces people to think. So crisis moments have got that effect. And there we were, engaged in this story making out of crisis, understanding the stories of other people. It was a moment to think. It was a moment to think about stories, and just as the thinking that is suggested by Giordano, for instance, you can think within your story or in your story production various narrative themes and issues that can come to mind. And we start off with the space within which we were, the border. Borders are of significance in literary and cultural studies, and the spaces of the border is of imagining openings. It's a space of departure. In most cases, it's a departure into a supposed beautiful or better world. It links with escape to the other side for all of us who were at the border post. considering the crisis in Zimbabwe. That has been going on for some time. And of course, for others, it was a stepping stone because they wanted to get into South Africa and then fly to other places. But then the stories enunciated by and lived from the border mobilities are punctuated by symbols, sound bites, and performances that reflect the paradox of allure and exclusion. As we walked through the border, there's a lot of, any border for that matter, there's a lot of surveillance. During that time, because of COVID, there were health surveillance issues as well. You had to have a COVID certificate or negative certificate, 72 days. We had been there from Monday to Thursday. So the South African government then had said everybody has to pass through the COVID testing before you go on to proper immigration and so forth. So it's also part of the surveillance. There are stop and search positions along the border, and as you drive away or from the border until you get to Messina. Some of it is old architecture that had been established before the SADC protocol, where if you are from SADC, you are given 90 days, a year, and so forth to go anywhere. Diversions, detours that had been established to search everybody who is coming into South Africa. And Ashil Mbembe writes a lot about this infrastructure of exclusion, this architecture of exclusion, which he established from his study of the exclusions, the migration that started in Europe from about those mass migrations, 2014, 2015, and so forth, in the Mail and Guardian article titled The Great Riddance. I want to argue then, drawing on one of the means to meet Gaye's idea on the agentic qualities of stories. And from my area of study then, which is the literary and cultural geographic, I then drew on perspectives from Foucault and Miskovic's, the idea on heterogeneous nature of space and heterotopic connections. Bakhtin's ideas that stories are always in dialogue. Stories speak to each other. So when you enunciate a story, when you create a story, when you live a story, it should speak to other stories that are lived by other people. When you read a story, it goes on to link you to other stories. When you think about stories, you also think about other stories. I'm also influenced, and these are some of the ideas that filter into this lecture. Lefebvre's idea on the concept of relational linkages between space, the lived, the built, and the social political context thereof. I was forced to think. I had many thoughts at that time, just as any story is supposed to, a lived story and any other story. So the jostling at the border and entrance into this survival, into this serial nowhere and nowhereness with all its hazards, invoked or forced me to remember stories or novels such as Amar's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. For those who have read it, it's about corruption, post-colonial corruption in a fictional Ghana. It's about the yearn for transformation. It's about the yearn for escape. And lo and behold, as we were all sitting there, waiting to cross over, everybody was talking about the beautiful ones not having been born in the Second Republic of Zimbabwe. The coup was like transportation into something better. But we were living evidence of, living stories of the beautiful ones not having been born. Stories coming out, we were engaging in so many things, just as stories do. It reminded me of Achebe's Hour of God, this fictional society in Nigeria, pre-colonial Nigeria, is now under immense pressure from colonial modernity, the introduction of colonial development, colonial issue, colonial plans, and how they disrupt even traditional institutional values on how life must be lived. And then the chief character, the chief priest Ezewulu, decides to send his son to learn the ways of the white man because, as the author says, as Ezewulu said, the world is like a mask dancing. If you want to see it well, you do not stand in one place. I like this pragmatism. And how does it link with stories? So I add stories to this body of the African literary canon, and in particular, the pragmatism depicted by Achebe, the idea of multivocality, or the polyphony of stories, as argued by Bakhtin. We need to hear other stories. We need to read other stories. And I also call for the need for us to draw parallels between stories describing the lived, imagined, and different nations using the ideas of a shared socio-economic, political aesthetics. For example, the lived story about the COVID pandemic. Everybody has a story. Survival, death, disease. We know that when we're living the pandemic, it created a global sense of shared precarity and empathy in humanity. That is despite the interventionist movements, in the government controls and whatever. Will then that empathetic ability not have been extended into understanding, for instance, the sense of the post-colonial regression of state in Zimbabwe? That was symbolized by the border crisis then. So that when it was flashed in the media, it was a popular issue, it was a popular topic in the media, on newspapers, and international media, and so forth. So as people were reading it, could they have not learned something if we were drawing on stories that already exist? Having drawn parallels from even smaller crises, for instance, that South Africans have been going through, the discomforts that they are living, as depicted in various stories, on township life, post-apartheid experiences, the hopelessness that the youth face, and so forth. Had that possibility, and in particular, the idea of the ambivalences of what was happening, could that have not been learned? The story had replicated or transported us to this. We then go on to other themes that we can think about, that can come out of this. A further thinking could be on stories to be made. And here I have drawing on the idea of possibilities, the futurist imaginings on life and the state of the nation. It speaks, the story that we lived at Bedbridge speaks to, it's a commentary on post-colonial African nations, post-colonial African governance, something that is very common in different forms, in different ways. And this is what I'm trying to say, that a story that is lived or read should enlighten the readers and society, and that then becomes being human, to learn from others and get to see that our story interacts with and links and should be learned and influence us with other stories. So a further thinking then could be, the futurist dynamic, and it comes from the story of the miraculous lifting of the car to bypass all the immigration issues, the idea of possibilities. There's a futurist dynamic in there. So perhaps this calls for possibilities of accepting other stories and tackling the crises and the human story. To consider moments of precarity in these stories and to envision not journeys into backwardness, but journeys into finding solutions and better ways of handling crises. How was this crisis solved? I pointed out about the arrival of the Minister of Home Affairs, the negotiations that took place, and the decision that those who legally have a right to enter should enter, and health protocols according to the COVID conditions should be followed. So everything flowed. So it was a solution. It was pragmatic because it was going to avoid the chaos on the other side, and it was also sensible in the sense that those who have a right to enter may enter as long as they meet the expectations, immigration-wise, health-wise, and so forth. That's perhaps a pragmatic decision that not necessarily echoes, but somehow can gesture towards the idea of the world being a mask that has to be looked at from different angles. Decisions have to be made by looking at issues from all angles and arriving at the most appropriate decision. That acts as an unit, as a standing point to solving a crisis, could have been learned, for instance, and created a possibility, perhaps, where the stories that were then acted in June 2021 of fire, death, and destruction could have been prevented in as much the same way as the minister or the decision was based on listening to the ordinary people's expectations, no matter how divergent they were, no matter how some criminal or potentially involved criminality crossing the borders without papers and so forth, no matter how they were unsettling and uncomfortable. So the lived story, the decision that are made, the futurist element of learning from what we have in the present so that it creates possibilities of avoiding further crises in the future is something that I draw from the story of the border post. And something that is interesting, the theme of features, African features, is featuring greatly in South African literature from the 27 April 2014 Sunday Times Life magazine special on short stories, vignettes that were written by various South African authors and celebrities on what life will be like 2034 and 2034. So there is this desire wanting to know what life will be like on environmental level, on important icons of the city, life in general. Another dynamic, futurism also coming out in Nigerian Afrofuturist literature. And we always talk about Nedi Okarafo. There's also a collection of short stories from science fiction, futurist stories from Africa that I think we are now getting into the third collection. So the future, the story and the stories of the future are very important. How then do I wrap up this thing, because time should not be more as expected? I want to give this, perhaps not so long, but I hope it's not going to be that long, conclusion that sums up the significance of learning from multiple and multi-located stories and how this links with being human. So being human involves the production of stories, and thus the need to read and listen to other stories. It will be the folly of any human being not to listen to theirs and other people's stories, past, present, and future. Gathered that there is the issue of the dangers of a single story, as Chimamanda Adichie says. Then there's also the idea, the danger of only having one perspective in a story and having a story that is so grand and dominant that it doesn't listen to other stories. We can also say that, and I can understand that, not listening to other people's stories, there's a folly there. We need to listen to other people's stories, as Chimamanda suggests. Even small voices are important. Even those narrated by those whom we think we don't share anything in common with. It's very important, because that contributes to the complexity, or that leads to the establishment of the wholeness of being human. I also underscore that stories create intertextual resonances and vicarious experiences. We gain from intertextualities. We read and we start thinking about other stories as well. And we laugh and we enjoy. Stories also make us better people in some way. They are enjoyable, and we need to do that. The imaginings invoke other possibilities and the technologies thereof that create vicarious experiences. Just thinking that somebody would lift my car and cross over is the stuff of Superman. My boys know that I love Superman, or maybe Hulk, who is easy to throw that, but Hulk will destroy it. So it's this transportation into this world where we can forget the moments of distress and find possibilities, and even the technology that comes with it. I started thinking when I looked at the images when we got home, the media, some of the pictures, I wish I had a drone so that I could have a drone's view of where we were and where the queue went to and what was happening, so that we could have a full picture of this ugly, beautiful story. We were in that moment. in hindsight, we were part of this story of that was something that was happening, and we had to do a lot of thinking. I had to do a lot of thinking. But I also needed to have a full picture. So stories also link us to other technologies. And that's pushing the idea of storytelling and story making into other realms, which we also need in the humanities. That extending the idea of humanities into other areas, so that we don't get left behind in our storytelling, in our story analysis, and in the storying itself, so that they become intertextual. We, for instance, like in Japan, where Haku is distributed on cell phones, you pay, you subscribe, and then they send it to everybody. So that also becomes a good economy for the writers in a way. Well, then, of course, I had to include this. When we got home, 3, 4, 5 months later, a friend of mine, this technology issue and giving a full picture, he calls me so excited. He traveled, he's now in Australia, in Perth, he works in the Outback, and then he sends me a story, he calls me and a video of him having operated a drone. He was part of this project to expand the mine. He had a fuller picture. So I realized technology also comes in. It helps, but then our stories should also involve these new technologies. As a way of concluding, from stories comes an understanding of the complexities of what it means to be human and the pleasures thereof, through the vicarious experiences constituted from reading and listening and researching and writing. These stories should make us realize that we are in this world together, linked by shared experiences and through similar socio-political aesthetics. The idea of where you come from or locally or what you experience can make us feel a shared experience, considering that most of our lives are influenced by the same socio-political and economic historical circumstances. There will be deviations and specificities. So those are the socio-political aesthetics that I'm talking about. These stories should also make us realize that we are somehow linked by occupying spaces upon which the stories are made, upon which stories are enunciated. You should be saying, oh, this is a story about Bloemfontein. I say in Bloemfontein, I want to read it. And then we become united in some way. We become linked. And also by realizing that the stories, the worlds which we are living are connected in ways which sometimes we do not understand. The heterotopic kind of dynamic. That's what it is to be human. This is what these stories should do. Make us realize who we are, link us, think, and create an element of togetherness based on storytelling, story production, and just knowing that we are part of the larger story of being on this planet Earth. I'm not so sure what I need to do with this technology. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Iri. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I just want to imagine Professor Iri and the whole family and the car being parachuted from the middle to the front in order to reach South Africa quickly. It is clear that you've got 2 young boys who are Superman and Batman, and who could have influenced that to materialize. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being part of this event. And thank you, Prof. Iri, for storytelling. As Africans, obviously, we love stories. And whether they are good or bad, or horror stories, but we still love stories. And thank you very much for taking us through that. in a scholarly way. And colleagues, my duty is a simple one, is that of inviting you for tea and refreshments at the foyer. But while we are gearing ourselves to do that, would allow Professor Iri and the wife to leave the hall and be on the doorsteps on the exit level for a handshake and a congratulatory message. And while Prof. Iri is doing that, together with the wife, we remain seated, and then we'll also leave after they have occupied the front door and for the shaking of hands. And thank you very much, colleagues. We see you again next week, the 14th, for another inaugural lecture. We prepared refreshments together with Prof. ID at the foyer. Thank you.